People are always talking about the rules of horror films. Even horror films talk about the rules of horror films.
Now you gotta die. Those are the rules.
I've always wondered why, of all the genres, horror tends to lend itself to this sort of self-reflexive analysis. Is it because the emotions that horror films try to provoke are so singular that they can only be generated through the use of very specific storytelling techniques? Or is it because the genre as a whole tends to be so formulaic and cliched that anyone who's seen more than 5 of them can start pointing out commonalities? I'm guessing it's probably a combination of both. Either way though, I'm not here to inventory a bunch of horror movie tropes today. I'm here to talk about one film in particular that seems to go way out of its way to subvert some of the more common horror movie archetypes, and yet still manages to terrify the holy living bejesus out of me. Cabrini Green, the most notorious neighborhood in all of Chicago history. A name synonymous with vice and violence, murder capital of the Midwest, nightmare on the near North Side. Artistic depictions of Cabrini Green haven't had to change much to instill a sense of dread and terror within the hearts and minds of their viewers. Look no further than the most iconic depiction of Cabrini Green in American cinematic history. Wait, stop. This won't do. This isn't scary at all. I wonder if that has anything to do with the fact that Cabrini Green was never the murder capital of the Midwest, or even the murder capital of Chicago. No, I think we're gonna have to go to some white-authored media to get to the scary stuff. Ah, that's more like it. Candyman tells the story of Helen Lyle, a U of I graduate student who's writing her thesis about urban myths in Chicago. While interviewing some case participants, she hears the story of Candyman, a vengeful ghost with a hook for a hand who'll split you from groin to gullet if you say his name 5 times in a mirror. The people who recount this tale to her go on to attribute a recent murder in the notorious Cabrini Green housing projects to Candyman.
It's true. Yeah, it is. I read it in the papers. Candyman killed her.
None of them live in Cabrini Green themselves, mind you, but they swear that Cabrini residents believe in the myth too.
I live on the south side, so I don't know too much about it, but my friend, she know all about it. Her cousin lived at Cabrini.
Helen's working theory is that the residents of Cabrini Green use fanciful myths like Candyman in an effort to rationalize and cope with the stresses of their daily lives.
An entire community starts attributing the daily horrors of their lives to a mythical figure.
In order to test this theory, Helen convinces her research partner Bernadette to come with her to Cabrini Green to interview some of the residents. But before they do, they go ahead and test the Candyman trigger.
Candyman, 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 Candyman. Candyman.
Oh, you chicken! You have to do it 5 times. Come on, go.
But nothing happens. Now, it's going to be impossible for me to talk about this film without giving at least some historical background on the setting. The Francis Cabrini row houses, later joined by the William Green homes, which together made up the Cabrini Green housing project, began life as a progressive public housing reformer's dream. Built on top of a notorious pre-World War II slum, the first homes that opened in 1942 featured full separate kitchens, private bathrooms, tenant-controlled heat, sturdy cinderblock construction, and fireproof materials, all of which were sorely lacking in the public housing projects of the time. The iconic white cinderblock and red brick high-rises that opened in 1957 featured elevators in every building and open-air balconies, which were meant to encourage socialization and outdoor playtime. Tenants paid a fixed price for rent and utilities based on a percentage of their annual income. The first tenants to move in described the homes as a paradise and some of the best housing they had ever lived in. Located on the near North Side, Cabrini Green was just a few blocks west of the Gold Coast, one of the most affluent neighborhoods in all of Chicago. But even in those idyllic early days, there were ominous auguries of things to come. Yes, auguries, look it up. House numbers on the buildings were painted in large, unfriendly, militaristic block letters, which wasn't terrible in and of itself, but when one of the principal architects of the project, Lawrence Amstadter, pointed out that installing metallic numbers would not only look better, but would also be cheaper, he was told that public housing had to look utilitarian, lest the more affluent taxpayers grow too fussy. Within a decade, Cabrini Green became one of the most violent neighborhoods in all of Chicago. Never the absolute worst, and rarely even in the top 5. But then its proximity to a bunch of rich white people probably had more than a little something to do with its notoriety. So what went wrong? Well, it wasn't any one thing. Actually, no, I take that back. It was one thing, which manifested itself in 1,000 different ways. Administrative disinterest. People were simply dropped into units and left to fend for themselves. Elevators broke down, trash chutes clogged, pipes froze, lights went out, and vacant units were left unlocked for drug dealers and vagrants to set up shop. Marriage was systemically discouraged, since getting married often meant a substantial drop in public aid.
60% of the households here are headed by single women. Patricia Welch is one of them, trying to raise 3 boys. 2/3 of Cabrini's residents are children.
When tenants moved out, they were replaced by people who made even less money in an institutional race to the bottom. Nationwide crime waves throughout the 70s and 80s didn't spare Cabrini Green, and very often the only outreach programs originated from within the community itself, or from lone outsiders who inevitably got more press simply by virtue of being white. The government's preferred method of reform was with these highly reactionary military-style raids, which came at a cost of $500,000 apiece for the Chicago taxpayers. For all its history, nobody in charge of Cabrini Green ever did much of anything to actually disincentivize any of the root causes of crime. Mayor Jane Byrne famously moved into Cabrini Green in 1981 in an effort to demonstrate her commitment to long-term reform, but she only stayed for 3 weeks, and the arrest policies that she dictated during her stay made no distinctions between homicidal gangbangers and kids caught with a bag of weed. The murder rate in Cabrini Green peaked in 1992, the same year that Candyman came out. So Helen and Bernadette venture into Cabrini Green and interview Anne Marie, the occupant of the unit adjacent to the recent murder.
I'm sorry we disturbed you.
We'll just get out of your way.
It's okay. I mean, I don't mean to be rude, and it's, just the white folks that come around here ain't too handshaking with us,
Anne Marie is certainly very familiar with the Candyman myth, but she doesn't seem to have an opinion of it one way or the other. Seems she'd rather not think about it at all.
They ain't never gonna catch him.
Who?
Candyman.
Wanting to dig deeper, Helen goes by herself to investigate a public bathroom where a horrific attack had occurred years earlier. And there she meets Mr. Sweets himself.
I hear you looking for Candyman, bitch. Well, you found him.
Oh, but he's not a vengeful ghost. He's just a local gang leader who's adopted the Candyman moniker as a way to increase his street cred. The film makes that immediately clear.
Number 5, step forward and say the line.
We hear you looking for Candyman, bitch.
Helen identifies her attacker, the gang leader goes to jail, and Helen suddenly got one hell of a lead for her thesis. And then this happens. Alright, we've got a lot to talk about here, so I'm not going to spend any more time on a scene-for-scene close reading of the film. My points of reference are going to jump around, and spoilers are going to drop without warning. If you want to avoid spoilers, but you also can't wait to hear what I have to say about this film, I suggest you pause this video and go watch it. Okay, everybody ready?
What's the matter, Trevor? Scared of something?
Earlier, I mentioned rules. Horror film rules. Candyman lives to break them. 3 in particular. The first rule that Candyman shatters is the idea that you need a high body count in order to keep an audience engaged. Death looms large in nearly every scene in the film, but when you actually go back and count, Candyman only kills a grand total of 2 people, and one of them off camera. That's what makes his one on-screen kill so mind-bogglingly jarring. Up until this point in the film, the threat that Candyman posed was largely ambiguous. This is actually, critically, the only evidence in the entire film that Candyman isn't just a figment of Helen's imagination. Now, it's not like Candyman is the only horror film that makes a low body count work for it. In fact, if you ask me, the best horror films aren't the ones that break the tension as often as possible, they're the ones that stretch it out for as long as they can. One of my other favorite horror films, The Ring, only has 3 deaths in it. Psycho, 2 deaths. The Fly? Just 1. Alright, that first rule was T-ball. Time for kid pitch. Where does Candyman really go above and beyond the conventional horror movie wisdom?
Bernadette! Sorry.
How about the fact that its antagonist is black? Now, on the one hand, I've never heard any horror movie nerd articulate a rule that your antagonist can't be black, so maybe it's not a thing. Then again, how many black horror film antagonists can you actually name? Off the top of my head, I can only think of 1. And I'm not sure Oogie Boogie counts. When Candyman first went into production, the producers booked a bunch of meetings between director Bernard Rose and the NAACP to get their take on the script. I haven't seen any official statements from the NAACP on this movie, but to hear Rose tell it, the reps were all like, why are we even having this meeting? This is just good fun. Why shouldn't a black actor play Freddy Krueger or Hannibal Lecter? If you're saying that they can't, it's really perverse. But that doesn't mean nobody complained. Several critics, including director Carl Franklin, pointed out that Candyman appears to play into several racist stereotypes, including, but not limited to, the idea that black people need a white savior in order to rescue them, that black people are especially superstitious, that they condemn or pay tribute in mass, and, not least of all, that black men prefer to pursue white women.
Be my victim.
It's a thing.
This interpretation is certainly worth considering. Are the filmmakers using race here just to perpetuate a bunch of racist stereotypes? Well, bottom line, I could never make that call for you. Come to think of it, neither could the filmmakers. It's not anyone's job to tell you what can and can't offend you. All I could ever hope to do is articulate my own personal take. My interpretation of this film is that it's very much a dramatization of the white fears associated with black poverty, and specifically white liberal fears. Not the fear that it'll spread necessarily, that's a conservative fear, but rather the fear that it can't be helped, even with our best efforts. Helen doesn't mean any harm, she might even call herself an ally, but she dies anyway. Perhaps there's a lesson to be learned in Helen's being something of a performative ally. Sure, she's got the best intentions, but for all her talk, she doesn't really listen to black people very well. Helen's working theory that a bunch of poor non-white people are more superstitious than a bunch of well-off Caucasians is something I actually heard in college. A professor said that ghosts pop up in Latin American literature so often because the authors are using fantastical elements to try and cope with the stresses of their daily lives. An argument that she never made about, say, British literature. By making its titular villain African American, the film is suddenly about so much more than just visceral horror. It's about societal, racial, and historical horror as well, albeit told from a white perspective. You bet your ass I'm excited for a Jordan Peele remake. I mentioned Good Times earlier, whose co-creator Eric Monte actually grew up in Cabrini Green. I consider it no small coincidence that the tones of either work are so mind-bogglingly different, given the backgrounds of their respective authors. Granted, these are two completely different projects with completely different intents, and I'm certainly not trying to imply that the full truth is contained within either of them. No single work of art could ever do that, but I think the juxtaposition is worth noting. And while this probably wasn't a deliberate intention of the filmmakers, one other thing that I take from the film, which is a direct result of the respective races of its two leads, is some tiny ersatz approximation of the fear that so many black people live with every day of their lives, that they could be killed for no reason, having committed no wrong, simply because of their panicky neighbors. Wouldn't that suck? The third rule of horror that Candyman breaks is probably the most significant, at least in my mind. It certainly gives the film the most staying power. This film is more sad than it is scary. In examining some of my favorite horror films, I've noticed that lots of them pair up with an emotion other than fear. Emotions like disgust.
Here goes.
Oh my God.
Anger.
Yeah, fuck you too!
Shame. Frustration. Guilt.
Don't do that. Ready?
But sadness is quite a bit rarer, and for good reason. Fear is a stimulant, depression is a downer, and you wouldn't think that they'd mix. Sadness tends to be the most common negative emotion that I personally experience, so I tend to be drawn to movies that have something to say about it. The thing that makes Candyman so sad to me is that its hero, victim, protagonist, whatever you want to call her, she doesn't transgress. Not in the usual sense. She's not an oblivious teenager, or an adulterous thief, or a jealous drunk with a massive inferiority complex who breaks the cardinal rule of science, don't drink and teleport. She's a researcher, a student, looking to bring understanding and aid to an underserved community. Some might argue that Helen transgressed when she said Candyman's name 5 times in a mirror, but Bernadette only said it 4 times, and she died anyway, and the psychologist never said it. And Candyman didn't show up to terrorize Helen for a long time after she first invoked his name. Not until 44 minutes into the movie.
Who is that?
So what actually triggered Candyman? Well, he tells us himself.
I am the writing on the wall, the whisper in the classroom. Without these things, I am nothing. So now I must shed innocent blood.
He's being really poetic about it, but it sounds to me like Candyman wants to murder Helen simply because she... You know what? Don't like this video. Don't repost it, don't reblog it. Let your eyes be the last set to ever see it. As a personal favor to me, I'm suddenly not sure how far I want it to go. Because when you really think about it, the only transgression that Helen commits against Candyman, the only reason he gives for wanting to kill her, is because she demystified him. Kinda like what I'm doing right now.
Who can take a sunrise, sprinkle it with dew, cover it in chocolate and the miracle.
The intersection of Halsted and Clybourne marks the northernmost boundary of what was the Cabrini Green housing project. It's at Dick's Sporting Goods now.
After a law was repealed in the mid-90s which required the construction of one new public housing unit for each unit of public housing that the city tore down, Chicago immediately began demolishing all the high-rises in Cabrini Green, with the last of them coming down in 2011. The residents were subsequently scattered across the south and west sides of the city, thems that could be scattered anyway. Many had to leave Chicago altogether, since the city didn't construct anywhere near enough new public housing to accommodate everyone who was displaced. The neighborhood soon saw billions of dollars in new construction and investment poured into it. It's now home to a bunch of high-end retail shops and multi-million-dollar condos. And a Target. Some of the original Francis Cabrini row houses do still exist. That way. But I'm not about to traipse down there and film them for you. Not because I'm afraid of getting shot or anything. Really, this is not a bad neighborhood anymore. I just don't want to add to Cabrini Green's long, sad history of poverty safaris. Don't get me wrong, Cabrini Green needed fixing. It needed it bad. And demolishing the high-rises might have even been a good start. But that's where the city called it quits. Keeping the poor mobile is not any kind of solution to poverty. When a group of Cabrini Green residents convinced the Chicago Housing Authority to turn control of one of the high-rises over to them in the mid-90s, the building saw a significant drop in crime and mechanical issues. Go figure. But when the tenants asked Mayor Daley for a public acknowledgement of their efforts, he refused and credited his raids with all the progress. While Chicago is technically one of the most racially diverse cities in America, with 1/3 of its population being black, 1/3 white, and 1/3 Hispanic, it's also one of the most segregated. Always has been. Despite the fact that it's also one of the most reliably democratic cities in America.
It's almost as if any political hegemony, regardless of which side of the aisle it sits on, inevitably results in widespread corruption.
Look, I don't consider myself an expert on any of this stuff. I have read a grand total of, one book about Cabrini Green. But I like to think I'm getting better at knowing what I don't know. And that right there is half the ballgame. The other half is knowing when to shut up and let the people who know better do the talking.